Cool. Well, tēnā koutou katoa, and tēnā koe Jerome, kei te rangatira, ngā mihi ki a koe, and thank you very much for your introduction, and also just thanks to everyone for having me along today, right at the end of the day too, to talk a little bit about KiwiNet and commercialisation and impact pathways. So, no tamaki makaurau ahau, ke kirikiriroa ahau e noho ana, ko pūtai me hangaru te mahi. Ko James Hutchinson toko ingoa. So my name's James. I'm originally from Auckland, now live in Hamilton, which I moved to via the UK. So I started my sort of journey in science, doing my undergrad up at the University of Auckland. Went over to Cambridge to do a PhD in synthetic organic chemistry. And then got the chance to move out into the field of science policy, which was really interesting, working for the Royal Society of Chemistry for about 5 years in the UK, which was quite fun, sort of doing what we could to help make sure that chemical science was informing public policy where it was needed, and also helping to lobby for more resources for the science system over there. And then moved back to New Zealand in 2014, where I've been involved in the commercialisation space ever since. So quite funny sometimes the journeys we end up on as scientists and researchers. But certainly, like throughout my whole journey, probably the thing that's always motivated me has been a real belief in the power of science to transform lives and change the world. And I'm sure I'm amongst friends that share that sentiment in the Zoom room today. And that particularly now more than ever, we've got so many big global challenges that we face, and that really, you know, science is going to be the key to providing sort of workable and scalable solutions. And that's really kind of what drives the KiwiNet kaupapa when we're thinking about commercialisation, that ultimately commercialisation can mean different things to different people and can be a bit of a dirty word. But for us, it's very much about that pathway to impact that enables a lot of our science to get out into the world to make a difference, particularly where we're talking about new products and services in the market. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And of course, some of the big challenges that we often talk about are the Sustainable Development Goals. And, you know, these came out about 5 or 6 years ago, but are still obviously as relevant today as what they were back then, especially if we look at number 7, affordable and clean energy, pretty relevant to this group, and climate action. I mean, seriously, if the IPCC report doesn't tell us that we should have taken our finger out years ago, you know, we just really need to do something, and we need to do it urgently. So a big part of this for me is about what can we do as KiwiNet, as a nation, as a global scientific community, to accelerate some of the solutions out into the world that are going to make a meaningful difference. And we see sort of the commercialisation pathways being a key mechanism to enabling us to do that as a scientific community. So this is our sort of view of the pathway to impact, and those that have sort of maybe have a sort of a dark policy wonk in the back of your minds there, that you might recognise this from MB's impact paper that they released a couple of years ago. So this is their results chain framework, and this is where they kind of see the sort of pathway from inputs into the research, science, and innovation system activity, and then how that leads on to outputs that get translated into outcomes that ultimately lead to the impact that we're trying to achieve on the economy, society, environment, and in the wider world. So the way that we kind of view commercialisation in quite a rudimentary way is to really think about transforming the outputs of research into outcomes that can ultimately go on to have an impact, a positive impact on society. So drilling into what I mean a little bit by that is that there's kind of the commercialisation pathway to impact. We kind of break down into 3 phases. We've got the research phase, which of course you will all be very familiar with. We've got what we then call the commercialisation phase, which is really that piece in the middle that helps to connect R&D through and out to those downstream, normally in the private sector, that have the money and the resources to be able to then scale that R&D around an identifiable kind of business plan or opportunity and actually get it out into the market where it can be used. And that middle phase is often something that is often, particularly by policymakers, is quite sort of misunderstood and is often under-resourced. And it's this sort of, we call it a critical connecting role, but also a very distinctive skill set in itself that requires quite specific resource. And in the system, that piece of the puzzle is normally looked after by our commercialisation officers, our tech transfer officers, working alongside researchers, of course, to help kind of take something from out of the research bit of the pathway and into that commercialisation phase. And that's, you know, where we're really talking about activity that's moving from developing and validating a scientific hypothesis to actually developing and validating a market hypothesis and a business model hypothesis that's going to get it to a point where those downstream can see something that can be invested in and then take it on. So really, you know, activities that's around securing the IP, validating the market, and creating a pathway to reach that market opportunity. And if anything, it's definitely not about making money. I think one of the great misconceptions about commercialization, because of the nature of the word and the kind of the exploitative connotation, is that it's solely about generating financial returns. And for us, it's less about that than it is about finding a sustainable business model to get it out and to the next downstream actors that can then take it on and scale it. And that's a lot of the work that we're trying to do, is to find that pathway and to validate it. So drilling into that a little bit further, this is essentially the pathway that KiwiNet is one of the organisations within the ecosystem that's helping to support commercialisation. This is the pathway that we're trying to support, or the bridge that we're trying to connect. And this is kind of what many of you will recognise as what's known as the valley of death when it comes to commercialisation of research, is that as you move along the commercialisation pathway, the available investment, and I'm sure you'll all be familiar with this, to actually further develop the technology once you get to the end of the research program starts to dry out. And there's almost sort of a gap between what we've done in the research phase and maybe downstream companies that might want to license something, or downstream investors that might want to invest in a spin-out company. There's a kind of gap between what we've currently done and what they want to see in terms of proof that the technology is something that's investable and that they can put their money in a way that they know that they can then generate a sustainable return to get it out into market. And so essentially that valley of death is what we're trying to bridge through some of the funds and support that KiwiNet provides, working closely alongside our commercialisation officers around the country. And the main intervention that we have in New Zealand to support that is the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund, or PSAF, which has been around since 2003, which is quite a long time given the context of the New Zealand science system, and is there to essentially fund and support early stage commercialisation activity. More recently, when it comes to the spin-out or startup route, we've now got the Callaghan Innovation Technology Focused Incubator Program as well, which is there to help kind of bridge the gap from the end of PSAF through to kind of viable startups alongside investment. So where did KiwiNet come from? Well, although the name suggests that we're a internet service provider, it's short for the Kiwi Innovation Network, and equally our precursor to that was Unicom, which also sounds like some sort of telecommunications company. We actually did have someone phone us up the other day wanting to, I kid you not, switch their energy provider to KiwiNet. So there you go, you can interpret it any which way you want. But we essentially started back in 2008, and the premise was these four organisations got together at the time, and recognising that commercialisation of research is really difficult. It takes a long time, it costs a lot of money, and if we're going to do it in New Zealand, we're quite a small country, we're quite spread out, we've got sort of limited resources and capability, we're going to be much better off by joining up our efforts and taking a team approach to commercialisation than trying to go it alone and do it individually. And so these four organisations got together. They said to Forced at the time, the precursor to MB, you know, why don't you guys give us our own pooled pot of pre-seed accelerator funding, and we'll set up a little investment committee around it and take a bit of a team approach, pool our knowledge, resources and networks to try and support the IP that's coming out of our respective institutions and maximise our chances of success. And so that was the precursor to what we have today, which is now all of the CRIs, as well as 7 of our universities and several IROs working together to help to kind of create this team approach across New Zealand to commercialising science. And the great thing about this is we benefit from all of the wisdom around the table on all of the knowledge and networks within the respective institutions. And we work really closely alongside University of Auckland, Auckland Uni Services and Return on Science within the broader commercialisation partner network as well. So there's a whole lot of collaboration across the entire system when it comes to taking this team approach to research commercialisation. So for KiwiNet, we've got a $20 million pre-seed accelerator fund that runs through till middle of next year, which we're looking pretty confident that we're going to be able to extend for a further 2 years, which is there to kind of essentially help to support public research opportunities that could be a new product or service, getting it across that valley of death and out into the next realisation phase and downstream to downstream investors where it can be scaled and got into the market. So drilling into that pathway a bit further, these are the sort of the ways in which we support commercialisation. So we have 2 levels of funding, Tier 1 and Tier 2, simple as that. Tier 1 is essentially an on-demand fund, which is essentially managed by our commercialisation officers. So as a research team, head along to have a chat to your local commercialisation manager, and they will kind of help you to kind of navigate the pathway. But essentially the purpose of a Tier 1 project, in a very kind of sort of rudimentary terms, is to work out, have you got a thing? So you have a piece of IP or an invention disclosure, and you kind of think, right, is there something within this that could be a new product or service? And is there a viable business model that we can identify for that piece of technology? So there's kind of 3 key areas that we're looking to validate as part of the that initial funding. The first is market validation. So is there a validated market out there that's worth pursuing? What is the size of that market in New Zealand and overseas? Bearing in mind that for a lot of technology commercialisation from New Zealand, there's a bit of a go big or go home mentality, in the sense that the New Zealand market is probably not going to be big enough to create a sustainable business model around the technology. And many of you that work in the energy space will be really familiar with that, the amount of capital that's going to be required to build scale, but also the markets that we're talking about to be able to get some sort of feasible return on that capital is actually quite substantial. And we're going to be looking at how we maybe start in New Zealand and then move internationally in order to get that to get that technology sort of out in a sustainable way, which is also a mechanism to get our science to a much wider audience and out to the wider world. Second is technology feasibility. So can the technology feasibly deliver on the market opportunity? And finally, do we have freedom to operate? So is the technology protectable in some way? And that might not be through formal patenting, that might be through kind of know-how and trade secret and things like that. So there's lots of ways in which we can work out how to protect the IP as part of a commercialisation plan. But importantly, we'll need to determine whether we've got freedom to operate and no one else has come up with our thing previously. So the whole question is, can we then wrap that together into a viable business model? And it has to be a compelling model that is firstly maximises benefit to New Zealand. So the whole premise of the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund, and the beauty of having it sort of funded centrally, is that we can take a benefit to New Zealand lens on it. So the whole purpose of the fund is not to try and maximise monetary return to an institution or to an individual. It's about thinking about how can we create a pathway here that's going to maximise benefit to New Zealand, and not just economic, about across all of the range of impact that's going to be beneficial from a New Zealand perspective. The second, is it commercially viable? And the third thing, most importantly, is if we were to fund it further, can we fund a plan that's going to get that thing to a point of investor readiness? And I'll come to what that means in just a moment. So across that kind of tier 1 level, which is essentially quite small amounts of money, it's amazing what how far you can get on the kind of the market validation commercialization plan where you've got small quantums of funding. We're talking about up to $40,000 in pre-seed funding, which is then matched by the host institution. So you can actually get quite far on small amounts of money. And the beauty of it, it's all about acceleration and trying to figure out if there's something, if there's nothing there, let's scale it and move on to the next thing. So it's about celebrating the fast failure in this process as well, that sometimes the business model doesn't stack up, so we might need to pivot or move on to the next thing. And we actually find that across the portfolio of projects that we fund, we have about 75% that sit in that fast fail bracket. About 16% of those get onto investor readiness, and about 9% of those would go on to tier 2, which are the bigger proposals that come back to our investment committee for larger pots of funding to execute out to that investor ready point. So these are the kind of the 3 flavors of outcomes that we're looking at in terms of our journey to impact. The first would be where we're looking to license the IP into an existing business. And that would either be in New Zealand or it could be offshore, depending on what's the most appropriate route for that technology. The second is we're forming a spin-out company alongside private investment. And the third is where we might be forming a joint venture alongside a commercial partner who might be well placed to sort of help commercialize the technology as it's getting along that pathway. And the whole idea is about how getting to that point is then going to be able to realise benefit to New Zealand and ultimately impact. Now, our approach to supporting this beyond the pre-seed fund is we kind of think of 2 pathways. The pathway in green is all about the project, which I've kind of described already, and there's a whole load of other programs and funding that we use to support that. And then the other pathway in purple is relating to how we support researchers. So one of the things that we realised early on is that it's all well and good to have great IP and research coming out of institutions and potentially flowing into our commercialisation offices. But unless we're actually empowering the research teams and the researchers that are behind these ideas, then we're not going to get very far, because there's a critical role in helping our researchers to at least to be able to better understand and be able to walk the commercialisation journey themselves. And this is not to say that we're expecting all researchers to become founders of spin-out companies or entrepreneurs in their own right, but there's certainly a base level of skills and capability that's empowering to be able to people to walk this journey. And I think actually Frank summarised some of the things that he's gained from his journey in the commercialisation process through the talk that he gave earlier, and the Liquium journey is a really nice example. So just to give a flavour of some of the things that we do offer, our Emerging Innovator program is probably our flagship program for researchers. And this is where it's a program where you're nominated by your commercialisation officers. And what we're looking for is researchers that have got a little bit of a spark for going on this entrepreneurial journey and want to learn more about commercialisation. And essentially we put you through a 12-month program that essentially gives you everything that we can possibly give you to help you to build up your skills and capacity in the world of commercialisation and entrepreneurship. So you get a paid commercial mentor for 6 months. There's a whole load of professional development programs that you get access to, including our Get Funded workshops and other support. And the REWA program that Frank also mentioned during his talk. You'll get some funding that you can use to essentially do that kind of technical development and that technical validation. Opportunities to go and do offshore market engagement, as well as access to all of our investor networks and things like that. And actually one of the key things now that we've grown the program is you get the opportunity to become part of this entrepreneurial community. So we've now funded 82 emerging innovators to date since we started the program back in late 2015, from across 16 organisations, research organisations. And those innovators have been able to leverage about $5.5 million in other funding from the Pre-Seed Accelerator Fund and their own institutions and elsewhere to support commercialisation of their technology. And overall, that's led to 15 new startup companies being created, alongside around 10 million in private downstream investment that's been raised. And one C Prize winner of course, who Aaron, sitting here on the call today. So great to have you here as well. And yeah, just interestingly, thinking about that downstream impact already from this program, we've got 39 full-time equivalents of jobs created in the deep tech startups that have emerged from the program in the pipeline. So this is a really nice program for anyone that's sort of interested in dipping their toe in the water in the commercialization space. So what I would probably finish up in saying is that, you know, when it comes to sort of getting involved in commercialization, I think I'll finish up by saying that now is the time to act. That, you know, if we think about the challenges that we face around energy and climate change, we don't have another 10 years to keep stuffing around. I think what I see about the amazing science and research that's coming out of our system in New Zealand, including some of the presentations I've seen this afternoon, we absolutely have the opportunities here in New Zealand to make a real difference in the world. And we've got this kind of team approach that we can actually do things quite quickly and we can be quite nimble. We've got a whole load of downstream venture capital that's waiting to invest in this space. And I think we just need to really get really quick and just speed this whole process up. And now is the time to do it. For KiwiNet, we're showcasing a suite of emerging energy and climate change technologies to James Shaw, the Minister of Climate Change, next week in Wellington, including some of the people on this call are going to be there as well. And we're really keen to say to him, look, we've got a whole pipeline of stuff that's ready to come into the come through that's going to help make a meaningful difference. So I'd say that whatever preconceptions you have about commercialization, you know, please come and talk to us. We're definitely here to help, and we're really happy to help connect you with the people in your own institutions and across the ecosystem that can support you on this journey, because we definitely have this great opportunity now to really put the hammer down. Feel free to get in contact with me or anyone else in the team. Kiwinet.org.nz is our website, where our contact details are there. And I've just put a link in the presentation, I'll chuck it in the chat, to our clean tech commercialization pathway map that we developed alongside SIFTI, which is quite a nice kind of like overview of the different support that's available at different stages of commercialization for clean tech technology. And yeah, with that, I'll hand back to Jerome. Ngā mihi kia koutou.
James, really good. And yeah, happy I can vouch for the Emerging Innovator program, having been through that. It's really good. Do we have some quick question before we close this session and the whole workshop? Thanks for the link, James.
Cool.
So, Jerome, can I?
Yes, go ahead, Chris.
So, James, one of the big challenges in a number of, particularly these industrial clean tech areas, is just scale. So a number of these technologies, I mean, the program I've been talking about earlier, hydrogen steelmaking is an example, but frankly, so is ammonia, so is cement, so is the rest of them. They don't start at units smaller than about $500 million. So it's all very well and good. We've got emerging innovator grants and tier 1 at 25K, but it's not so much they don't even touch the sides as we don't even notice them.
Yeah.
So where is KiwiNet's role in trying to access the tens of millions of dollars of still early stage value of death pre-scale up funding that you need to make a 50 kilogram an hour reactor that's running about a meter cubed of hydrogen through it every few minutes? How do we get around that? I know California does it by just going straight to VC, but we don't have that visibility. So
Chris,
does KiwiNet have a role to find me that much money?
You know, Chris, you'd know that better than anyone else with the with what you're working on, for sure. And you're absolutely right. That is a big gap. What we're working on at the moment is actually first thing I would say is that now versus, say, even 2 years ago, there's a shed load more venture capital around downstream from, say, KiwiNet, that does have significant amount of capital to invest in this space in New Zealand, which is something that unlike we've ever seen in the past. But equally, I would say that that's still not the full solution to the problem, given that a lot of that capital will be quite dilutive. one of the things that we're working on with Wellington NZ, and we'll hopefully be pitching to Minister Shaw next week, is the need for almost like a climate tech venture fund. And what I'm sort of talking about here is like actual capital, like you're talking about. So how do we get access to the multi-million-dollar pots of funding that we actually need to build the technology feasibility that's even just at pilot scale? And if you think about the level of capital that we need to do that, and to be able to access that quickly, not trying to kind of do it over a 10-year period and trickling bits of funding in and trying to limp along, if we're really serious about that, then we need to think about making that, that capital available. So I think for me, there's a kind of combination here of an opportunity for government to intervene, if we're talking about funding that we've now got available through through the climate budget and things like that, but equally finding mechanisms to enable venture capital to come in a lot earlier. So we're actually looking at pushing on both of those fronts at the moment, creating trusted mechanisms to enable VC to come in earlier, but also thinking about ways in which government might be able to intervene to provide that I don't want to call it no strings attached, but certainly non-dilutive capital that, you know, and having a good system to invest that, so we're not throwing good money after bad and the right opportunities that can help bridge that gap as you've highlighted. But that is absolutely a key issue to scaling this from New Zealand.
Yeah, thanks.
That is really encouraging to hear, James. I think that's going to interest a lot of people, and it's, yeah, let's see how it all goes. And so thanks again, James, for the presentation. Thanks everybody.